A kindness forgotten. The icy grip of winter had taken over the city. Snow blanketed the sidewalks, and trees stood bare and brittle, casting skeletal shadows under dim streetlights. It was one of those days when everyone rushed along with their heads down, faces buried in scarves and collars, each person wrapped in their own thoughts and eager to escape the biting cold. Among the bundled-up pedestrians, 13-year-old Caden Jameson trudged home, his steps slow and heavy. He wore his worn, oversized jacket, the same one he'd had for years, which now barely reached his wrists. Despite the frigid air that seemed to seep through every seam, Caden took his time, observing people as they passed. Unlike most of the other kids his age, he didn't just walk by. He noticed things: the weary eyes of a construction worker, the hurried pace of a mother with her young child, and the subtle frowns etched into strangers' faces. Caden was a boy with a big heart, wise beyond his years, yet the last few weeks had been especially difficult. His father, a man of few words but deep principles, had recently taken on a second job to make ends meet. This left Caden to fend for himself most evenings, navigating the long trek home from school through the bustling city. He didn't mind. He was proud of his dad and knew he worked hard to give him a good life. Today, Caden was particularly eager to get home. His father had promised they would have a rare evening together, something Caden looked forward to with great anticipation. He clutched the strap of his backpack tightly as he walked, ignoring the sting of the wind on his face. As he rounded the corner, Caden's steps slowed when he noticed an older woman huddled against a building, her frail body barely protected from the cold by a tattered shawl. Her hands were blue with cold, and she clutched them to her chest, as if holding onto a shred of warmth that was rapidly slipping away. Most people walked by without so much as a glance, but Caden felt a tug in his heart that he couldn't ignore. He approached her cautiously, his breath visible in the cold air. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked softly. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were filled with a sadness that cut through Caden's heart. I'm all right, child. Just a little cold," she replied, her voice trembling as much as her hands. Without a second thought, Caden shrugged off his coat and handed it to her. "Here, take this. I'll be fine," he said, smiling in a way that belied the chill that was already setting into his bones. The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. "Oh no, I can't possibly take that from you, young man." Caden shook his head firmly. "You need it more than I do. Please, take it." She finally relented, pulling the coat around her shoulders. A tear slipped down her cheek, freezing halfway down. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're a kind soul, child. May blessings follow you for this." Caden smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. He nodded and continued on his way, feeling lighter despite the cold that seeped through his thin sweater. Little did he know that this small act of kindness would set off a series of events he could never have anticipated. The ripple effect. The next day, Caden's morning felt colder than usual. Without his coat, he wrapped himself tightly in his only sweater, pulling the hood up to keep his head warm. Despite the biting cold, he felt a sense of satisfaction. Recalling the look of gratitude on the elderly woman's face, he hoped his coat had kept her warm through the night. School was just a short walk away, and Caden moved briskly, ignoring the curious glances from classmates who noticed his lack of a winter coat. Most of them simply stared, their faces twisted in expressions of mild confusion. But no one said anything directly to him. By the time he made it to first period, his fingers were numb, and he could barely feel his nose. He slipped into his seat, shivering, and tried to focus on the teacher's voice. But before long, he felt a tap on his shoulder. "Hey, Caden," whispered Maya, the girl who sat behind him. She had a concerned look on her face. "Where's your coat? It's freezing out there." "Oh, I gave it to someone who needed it more," he replied quietly, hoping the conversation would end there. Maya's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but she smiled. "That's really nice of you, Caden. But Aren't you cold? He shrugged. It's not so bad. I'll be okay. The bell rang, ending their conversation, but Caden noticed a few other kids looking his way, whispering to one another. He knew word would spread fast. As the day went on, Caden began to realize that his simple act of kindness had sparked a quiet but noticeable ripple through his school. Teachers gave him sympathetic smiles, and a few classmates offered him their gloves or scarves, which he politely declined. During lunch, he was surprised when Mr. Thompson, the school counselor, approached him. Mr. Thompson was known for his cheerful demeanor, always trying to connect with the students. Today, though, his smile seemed tinged with concern. "Hey, Caden," he greeted, sliding into the seat across from him. "How's it going?" Caden paused, caught off guard by the counselor's sudden attention. It's okay. I noticed you didn't have a coat today. I heard you gave it to someone in need. Is that true?" Caden nodded, suddenly feeling a bit self-conscious. "Yeah, she was really cold, and I thought she needed it more than I did." Mr. Thompson's eyes softened. That was a brave thing to do. Not many people would think of others like that. "But are you sure you're all right without it? Winter's only going to get colder." Caden tried to keep his voice steady. "I'll be okay. My dad and we don't have much, but we manage." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, as if he understood more than Caden was saying. "I'll tell you what, Caden. We have a donation program here at the school. Maybe we can help you get a new coat, just until you're warm enough for the winter." Caden's pride kicked in. He shook his head. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson, but I'm fine. I don't need any help." The counselor smiled, clearly respecting Caden's independence. "All right, I won't push, but know that the offer stands. And Caden, it's okay to accept help sometimes. Kindness, like the one you showed, has a way of coming back around when you least expect it." The day went on, but Caden couldn't shake the warmth that Mr. Thompson's words had left in his heart. He hadn't thought of his act as brave or particularly special. It had just felt like the right thing to do. But now, with all the attention, he began to feel the weight of it. He hoped that wherever she was, the elderly woman was safe, his coat still keeping her warm. An unexpected visitor. That evening, Caden made his way home through the gathering dusk. He hadn't expected what he would find when he opened the door. "Dad," he called, setting down his backpack as he stepped inside their small apartment. The delicious aroma of soup filled the air, and he could hear soft voices from the living room. To his surprise, he found his father sitting on the couch, talking to two men in uniform, police officers. A cold knot formed in Caden's stomach as he wondered if he had done something wrong. "Caden, come in," his dad called, his voice steady, but his face lined with worry. "These officers want to speak to you." One of the officers, a tall man with a kind face, nodded at him. "Caden Jameson, we just want to ask you a few questions." Caden swallowed, his voice barely a whisper. "Okay." The officer spoke gently, his eyes meeting Caden's with a sense of respect. "We understand you helped a woman in need yesterday." An elderly woman, wearing a thin coat and a shawl. Caden nodded, the memory of her frail figure flashing through his mind. "Yes, sir. She looked really cold. I gave her my coat." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before turning back to Caden. "Caden, that was a very kind thing to do. We're actually looking for her. She's been missing for several weeks, and her family is very worried. Your coat might have helped her survive the night." Caden's heart sank as he processed the information. The woman was lost, and he hadn't even known it. All he had seen was her cold, shivering frame. He hadn't thought to ask why she was out there in the first place. Do you know where she is now?" he asked, a pang of guilt tugging at his chest. The officer shook his head, his expression solemn. "Not yet, but with your help, we might be able to find her." "Did she say anything to you? Anything that might help us locate her?" Caden thought back to the encounter, trying to recall every detail. "No, sir. She just thanked me. She didn't tell me where she was going." The officers nodded, though Caden could see the faint shadow of disappointment in their eyes. They handed him a card with a number to call if he remembered anything else, and thanked him for his kindness. As they left, his father placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did a good thing, son," his dad said softly, his voice filled with pride. Not everyone would have given up something so important to help a stranger. Caden nodded, though his heart was still heavy with worry. He hoped she was all right, wherever she was. He could only pray that his coat had helped her, even if just a little. The ripple continues. The next morning, the story of Caden's kindness spread even further, and it reached ears he had never imagined. After his encounter with the officers, the school counselor decided to share Caden's story with the principal, who was moved by the boy's selflessness. Soon, the entire school knew about the boy who had given away his only winter coat to a stranger in need. But it didn't stop there. By lunchtime, Caden was approached by a reporter from the local newspaper. Word had traveled fast, and the city's community was eager to know more about the boy who had displayed such remarkable kindness. "Caden, could we have a few words?" the reporter asked, microphone in hand. "The whole community wants to hear about your act of kindness." Caden, feeling shy and slightly overwhelmed, shifted uncomfortably. I just did what anyone would have done." But the reporter smiled warmly. "Not everyone would have given up their only coat in the middle of winter. It's an inspiring story, Caden, and I think people need to hear it." They asked him a few more questions, and soon, Caden's story was published in the local newspaper under the headline, "Local Boy's Kindness Warms the City's Heart." As he read the article later that evening, Caden was filled with mixed emotions. He hadn't expected any of this, and while the attention was overwhelming, he hoped that it would somehow help the elderly woman he had met. He only wished he could do more to ensure her safety and well-being. As he went to bed that night, Caden held on to the hope that wherever she was safe, and maybe, just maybe, she'd feel the warmth of a community's care surrounding her, even from afar. A city that cares. The following morning, Caden's life seemed to have taken on a surreal quality. As he walked through the school halls, students he barely knew nodded at him in recognition, and some even smiled or gave him a pat on the back. Teachers, too, looked at him differently, with a mixture of pride and admiration. But what surprised him most was the visit he received during lunch. "Caden, could you come to the office for a moment?" Mrs. Woods, his homeroom teacher, asked with a gentle smile. Curious, he followed her to the front office, where he was greeted by the sight of a small crowd. The principal, Mr. Garvey, a few teachers, and, to his shock, the same reporter from the newspaper, along with a cameraman from a local news station. "Caden," Mr. Garvey began, his voice warm and full of pride, "we're all so inspired by what you did for that woman. Your kindness has touched this community, and we wanted to show you just how much we appreciate you." Caden shuffled his feet, feeling his cheeks heat up as everyone's eyes turned to him. He didn't know how to respond. He had only done what felt right. But he managed a small smile, nodding politely. The reporter from the local news station stepped forward. "Caden, we'd like to do a short interview with you for the evening news. We think it's important that others hear your story, especially in a time when acts of kindness are so often overlooked." The idea of being on TV made Caden nervous, but then he remembered what his father always told him, that sometimes you have to step out of your comfort zone if it means you're doing something that matters. "Okay," he agreed, his voice quiet but determined. They guided him to a seat in the principal's office, setting up a small camera in front of him. The cameraman adjusted the lens, and the reporter positioned herself beside him, holding a microphone. The questions began simply enough, asking about his life, his family, and what had inspired him to give his coat away. Caden answered as best as he could, keeping his answers short and humble. But then the reporter asked a question that made him pause. "Caden, when you gave your coat away, did you think it might put you at risk of being cold this winter?" Caden hesitated, glancing down at his hands. He hadn't really thought of it that way. In his mind, the woman's need had been so great that his own discomfort didn't even matter. Still, he knew that without his coat, the weeks ahead would be tough. I guess I didn't really think about that," he said finally. "I just thought she needed it more than I did." The reporter nodded, visibly moved by his words. "That's a very selfless perspective, Caden. It's not often we see such compassion in someone so young. Thank you for sharing your story." As the interview wrapped up, Mr. Garvey and the teachers clapped, clearly impressed by Caden's responses. But just as he was about to leave, the principal stopped him. "Caden, wait a moment," Mr. Garvey said. He walked over to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a box wrapped in brown paper. "We have something for you, a small token of appreciation." Caden's eyes widened as Mr. Garvey handed him the box. He peeled off the wrapping carefully, revealing a brand new, thick winter coat in his favorite shade of navy blue. It was far warmer and better fitting than the old one he'd given away, and he felt a surge of gratitude. Thank you so much," he stammered, looking around at the smiling faces. He hadn't expected anything in return for his gesture, and he was overwhelmed by the kindness that had come back to him. "Consider it a small reward from the school," Mr. Garvey said with a smile. "And remember, sometimes kindness does come back to you when you least expect it." The story reaches further. That evening, Caden sat with his father in their small living room, watching the evening news. When his face appeared on the screen, he felt a rush of embarrassment and pride all at once. He glanced at his father, who had a wide grin on his face, his pride unmistakable. "That's my boy," his father said softly, patting him on the shoulder. "I always knew you had a good heart, Caden, but seeing you there, it makes me so proud." Caden smiled, his heart swelling with happiness. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something right, something that truly mattered. The news segment played, showing clips of Caden's interview and a short story about his act of kindness. As he watched, he couldn't shake the hope that somehow the elderly woman would see it too, that wherever she was, she'd know that he hadn't forgotten her. But what neither Caden nor his father expected was what happened next. Just as the segment ended, there was a knock at the door. Caden's father raised an eyebrow, glancing at him with a mixture of curiosity and surprise. "Who could that be at this hour?" his father murmured, standing up to answer the door. Caden followed him, and when the door opened, he saw two figures standing in the dim light. One was Officer Ramirez, the kind police officer who had spoken to him the day before. The other was a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, with a worried expression. "Good evening, Mr. Jameson," Officer Ramirez greeted, nodding politely. "I apologize for the late visit, but we have some important news to share with Caden." Caden's heart skipped a beat as he wondered what this could mean. "This is Sarah Thompson," Officer Ramirez continued, gesturing to the young woman beside him. "She's the granddaughter of the woman you helped." Caden's eyes widened in surprise as he looked at Sarah, who smiled at him with tears in her eyes. "Caden, I don't even know how to thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Your kindness to my grandmother, it means more than you can imagine. We've been searching for her for weeks, and thanks to you, we might have a lead on her location." Caden's face lit up with hope. You found her." Sarah nodded, though her smile was tinged with sadness. "Not yet, but some people saw your story on the news, and they recognized her description. They told the police they saw a woman fitting her description near the old bus station a few nights ago. We think she might still be in the area." Officer Ramirez stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Caden's shoulder. "Caden, your story has brought hope to a lot of people, including Sarah and her family. They've been worried sick about Ms. Thompson, and now they finally have a chance to find her." Caden felt a rush of relief and pride. He hadn't imagined that his small act could have such far-reaching effects. I just wanted her to be warm," he said quietly, almost to himself. Sarah nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "And because of you, she might have made it through the cold nights. Thank you, Caden. Really." Before they left, Sarah handed him a small piece of paper. "This is my number. If you ever want to know how she's doing, or if there's anything we can do for you, please don't hesitate to call." Caden nodded, slipping the paper into his pocket. As he watched them walk away, a warm sense of fulfillment spread through him. It was a feeling that went beyond gratitude or pride. It was a deep, quiet satisfaction, knowing that his choice had made a difference in someone's life. A lesson in kindness. The next day, Caden returned to school with a renewed sense of purpose. He wore his new coat, feeling its warmth and knowing that it, too, was a symbol of kindness and generosity. As he moved through the halls, he noticed other students glancing at him with admiration, and some even greeted him with words of encouragement. But what struck him most was when he found a folded piece of paper in his locker. It was a handwritten note, unsigned, and it read, "Thank you for showing us all that kindness still matters. You've reminded me that I can make a difference too." Caden held the note in his hand, his eyes stinging with tears he fought to hold back. He hadn't realized just how much of an impact his small action could have, not just on the woman he'd helped, but on his entire community. That afternoon, as he walked home through the snow, he noticed something unusual. A man standing on the corner, offering free cups of hot cocoa to passersby. There was a sign beside him that read, "A little kindness goes a long way. Let's keep the warmth going." Caden couldn't help but smile. His simple act of giving had sparked a movement in his community, inspiring others to do the same. And as he took a cup of hot cocoa from the man and continued on his way, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the warmth of the drink, but for the warmth of the human spirit that now seemed to surround him. Searching for Eleanor. The days passed, and Caden's life became a whirlwind of events. Every morning on his way to school, he noticed new acts of kindness inspired by his story. Neighbors helping to clear each other's snowy walkways, students organizing donation drives, and even a local bakery offering free bread to those in need. It seemed as if a spark of compassion had spread through the city, warming even the coldest hearts in the depths of winter. Yet, despite the community's newfound spirit, Caden couldn't shake his concern for the woman he had helped. Every night, he lay awake wondering where she was, and if she was safe. The fact that he had potentially helped her survive a night in the cold brought him a measure of comfort, but it wasn't enough to ease his mind entirely. One Saturday morning, just as the sun was beginning to pierce through the clouds, Caden's phone rang. He recognized the number immediately. It was Sarah, Eleanor Thompson's granddaughter. He sat up, his heart racing, hoping for good news. "Hello," he answered, trying to keep the anticipation out of his voice. "Caden, it's Sarah. I have some news," she said, her voice both hopeful and anxious. "We haven't found her yet, but we have another lead. Some people have seen her near the old bus depot on the other side of town. It's not much, but it's a place to start." Caden felt a surge of determination. "Can I come with you to look?" There was a pause on the other end, and he could almost hear Sarah weighing her options. "It might be dangerous, Caden. I don't want you getting hurt. I know the area," Caden replied confidently. "And I want to help. I don't think I can just sit here while you're out there looking." Another pause, followed by a soft sigh. "All right. Meet me there in an hour, but stay close to me, okay?" Caden agreed, grabbed his new coat, and headed for the bus station. His father was supportive, though a bit wary. "Just be careful, son," he said as he handed Caden a thermos of hot tea. "And remember, if anything doesn't feel right, come home." Caden nodded, appreciating his father's understanding. He set off with a determined heart, the cold air biting at his cheeks as he made his way across town. The streets were quiet, covered in a fresh layer of snow that sparkled in the early light. The search begins. When Caden arrived at the bus depot, he found Sarah waiting in her car, parked under a flickering streetlight. She waved as he approached, and he climbed into the passenger seat, grateful for the warmth inside. "Thank you for coming," she said, a look of exhaustion and gratitude in her eyes. "We're hoping she might still be in the area. Sometimes, people in her situation don't move far if they find a spot that feels safe." They started the car, slowly driving around the bus depot and the surrounding streets. Caden peered out the window, scanning every corner and alley for any sign of Eleanor. The area was mostly deserted. The abandoned buildings and broken-down buses gave the place a haunting feel, as if it had been forgotten by time. Sarah drove in silence, occasionally glancing at Caden. "You know, my grandmother wasn't always like this," she said quietly, as if talking to herself. "She used to be a teacher, a really good one. Everyone loved her." Caden turned to her, surprised. "She was a teacher?" Sarah nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yes, she taught third grade for almost 20 years. She was the kindest person I knew. But after my grandfather passed, she just couldn't cope. It's like a part of her was lost, and no one could bring her back. I tried to help, but eventually, she just disappeared." Caden listened intently, his heart aching for Sarah and her grandmother. He realized that Eleanor wasn't just a stranger. She was someone with a life, a family, and a story. And now, that story was incomplete, waiting to be rewritten. As they continued their search, Caden noticed a small figure huddled against the side of a rundown building. His heart skipped a beat, and he pointed. "Over there." Sarah immediately pulled over, and they both got out of the car. As they approached, Caden's excitement faded, and his heart sank. It wasn't Eleanor. It was another elderly woman, bundled up in a thin blanket, her face hidden beneath a hood. But even though it wasn't Eleanor, Caden couldn't bring himself to leave her there without offering some help. He approached her slowly, kneeling down beside her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked gently. The woman looked up, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. She shook her head, muttering something unintelligible. Sarah stepped forward, pulling a spare blanket from her car and draping it over the woman's shoulders. "Here, take this," she said softly. "Do you need anything else? Food, water?" The woman nodded weakly, her voice barely a whisper. "Just somewhere warm. It's so cold." Without a second thought, Sarah called a local shelter, arranging for them to send someone to pick the woman up. Caden watched as they waited with her, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. This woman wasn't Eleanor, but at least she wouldn't have to face the cold alone tonight. After the shelter van arrived to take the woman, Caden and Sarah resumed their search, though the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the empty streets. A flicker of hope. As they drove through one last alley, Caden spotted something that made him gasp. There, lying in the snow, was a bright red scarf, the same one he had given Eleanor. His heart pounded as he pointed it out to Sarah. She quickly stopped the car, and they both jumped out, hurrying over to the scarf. Caden picked it up, his fingers brushing over the familiar fabric. It was damp and cold, but unmistakably his. "She was here," he whispered, his voice filled with hope. "She must have been here recently." Sarah's eyes shone with determination. "Then she might still be close by. Let's keep looking." They combed through the area, calling Eleanor's name softly as they searched. The darkness thickened around them, the streetlights casting eerie shadows on the snow. Just as they were about to give up, they heard a faint sound, a cough, followed by the shuffling of footsteps. Caden's heart leaped as he followed the noise, his breath visible in the icy air. Around the corner of a building, huddled beneath a broken awning, was Eleanor. Her face was pale, her eyes half closed, but she was alive. "Grandma!" Sarah cried, rushing forward. She knelt beside her, gently touching her shoulder. "Grandma, it's me, Sarah. I'm here." Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, a look of recognition dawning on her face. "Sarah," she murmured, her voice weak but filled with relief. Caden felt a wave of joy wash over him as he watched the reunion. Sarah held her grandmother close, tears streaming down her face as she whispered comforting words. For a moment, it was as if the cold and darkness had disappeared, replaced by the warmth of love and relief. The return home. After ensuring Eleanor was stable, Sarah helped her grandmother into the car, wrapping her in blankets and gently stroking her hair. Caden climbed into the back seat, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment and peace. "Thank you, Caden," Sarah said, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "If it weren't for you, I don't know if we would have found her in time." Caden shook his head, his face flushed with humility. "I just did what felt right. I'm glad she's safe now." As they drove Eleanor to a nearby hospital for a checkup, Caden noticed her clutching the red scarf tightly, as if it were a lifeline. She looked back at him, her tired eyes shining with gratitude. "Young man," she said softly, her voice full of emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved me that night, with just a little bit of warmth. I'll never forget it." Caden smiled, feeling a warmth that no winter chill could touch. He didn't need any thanks. Knowing that Eleanor was safe was enough. He reached forward, touching her hand gently. "You're going to be okay now, Miss Thompson. You're not alone anymore." As they reached the hospital, Caden watched Sarah and Eleanor walk inside, the red scarf standing out against the stark white snow. The image stayed with him, a reminder of how one small act of kindness could change lives, even in the most unexpected ways. When he finally returned home, Caden found his father waiting for him with open arms. They embraced, the warmth of his father's hug seeping into his bones, easing the weariness of the long day. That night, as he lay in bed, Caden felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He realized that kindness wasn't just an action. It was a bond, a thread that connected people and reminded them of their shared humanity. And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that he would carry this lesson with him forever. Kindness echoes back. The day after Caden helped reunite Eleanor with her family, life felt different. As he walked through the city streets, bundled in his new coat, he noticed how everything seemed a bit brighter, as if winter's chill had lost some of its harshness. And it wasn't just the weather. People's faces were softer, their glances kinder. The simple story of a young boy's compassion had spread far and wide, becoming a symbol of hope and warmth in the coldest season. Caden didn't fully understand how his small act of kindness had blossomed into something so impactful. What he did know was that Eleanor was safe, that her family had been made whole again, and that something inside him had shifted forever. He made his way to school, his breath misting in the air, and tried to go about his day as usual. But usual seemed to have taken on a new meaning. His classmates treated him differently, more respectfully, with a sense of admiration that made him a little self-conscious. Teachers gave him approving nods, and a few even stopped him in the hall to commend him on his kindness. But what surprised him most was when he reached his locker and found a note folded and slipped through the vent at the top. Curious, he unfolded it, and his eyes widened as he read. "Thank you, Caden. Because of you, I believe kindness is real again." It was unsigned, but Caden felt a warmth spread through his chest as he read the words. He slipped the note into his pocket, savoring the small reminder that his actions had truly made a difference. An unlikely opportunity. That afternoon, Caden was called to the principal's office. He walked there, his heart thumping, wondering what it could be about. Mr. Garvey, the principal, greeted him with a smile as he stepped inside. "Please, have a seat, Caden," Mr. Garvey said, gesturing to a chair in front of his desk. Caden sat down, clutching his backpack nervously. He wasn't in trouble. He knew that much. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. "Caden," Mr. Garvey began, his voice warm and encouraging, "you've become quite the hero in our school and even in the wider community. Your story has touched so many lives, and it's clear that you have a rare gift for kindness and compassion. Because of this, I received a call from someone very special who wants to meet you." Caden's eyes widened in surprise. "Who?" "Do you know Mr. Jack Harrison?" Mr. Garvey asked, watching his reaction carefully. He's the owner of Harrison Enterprises, one of the largest companies in the city. Caden shook his head slowly. He had heard the name in passing but knew little about him. His family didn't have much, so big companies and famous CEOs weren't part of his world. "Well," Mr. Garvey continued, "Mr. Harrison read about your story in the newspaper. He was moved by what you did for Miss Thompson and wants to invite you to speak at a special event for his company. He believes your story could inspire others to embrace kindness and compassion in their lives and work." Caden's mouth fell open. Him. Speak in front of people. The thought filled him with both excitement and fear. I don't know what I'd say," he stammered, feeling his cheeks flush. Mr. Garvey smiled reassuringly. "Just be yourself, Caden. That's what everyone loves about you. You don't need to impress anyone or act a certain way. Just tell your story, the way you did with us. Besides, it's an opportunity for you to share what kindness means to you." Caden took a deep breath, nodding slowly. It was daunting, but maybe, just maybe, he could do it. "When is it?" he asked, his voice steadier now. "Next Friday," Mr. Garvey replied. "We'll arrange for someone to drive you there, and your father is welcome to come with you. Think about it, Caden, and let us know by tomorrow." Caden nodded, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. As he walked back to his classroom, his mind raced. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, but the thought of inspiring others felt like a challenge he couldn't ignore. Preparing for the big day. Over the next week, Caden prepared for his speech with his father's help. Each evening, they sat together at the kitchen table, practicing what he would say. At first, Caden's voice shook, and he stumbled over his words, but gradually he grew more confident. His father coached him gently, encouraging him to focus on the emotions he had felt when he'd given away his coat and when he had seen Eleanor reunited with her family. "Just speak from the heart," his father would say, clapping him on the shoulder. "People will hear the truth in your voice, and that's all that matters." By the time Friday arrived, Caden felt as ready as he would ever be. He dressed in his best clothes, an outfit his father had carefully ironed the night before, and they both took a cab to Harrison Enterprises, a gleaming high-rise in the center of the city. As they entered the building's lobby, Caden felt dwarfed by the grandeur of it all. The marble floors, the towering glass walls, and the smartly dressed people moving about with purpose. He took a deep breath, feeling the surge of nerves, but his father's reassuring presence grounded him. They were escorted to a large auditorium, where rows of chairs were filled with employees from all levels of the company. At the front of the room stood a podium, surrounded by screens displaying Caden's name and the words, "The Power of Kindness." When the time came, Mr. Harrison himself, a tall, gray-haired man with a friendly smile, introduced Caden to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have a very special guest with us today. His story has reminded us all of the importance of compassion, and I hope his words will inspire you as much as they've inspired me." Caden took a deep breath, gripping the sides of the podium as he stepped up to speak. His hands shook, but as he looked out at the audience, he reminded himself of his father's advice. Speak from the heart. He began to tell his story. The simple act of giving his coat to someone in need, the feeling of worry that followed, and the surprise of seeing his kindness come back to him in unexpected ways. He spoke about Eleanor and Sarah, about how helping someone could connect you in ways you never anticipated. "As I was looking for Miss Thompson," he said, his voice growing stronger, "I realized that kindness isn't just about one person helping another. It's about all of us realizing that we're part of something bigger. We might not know everyone's story, but we can still care. We can still choose to make someone's life a little bit better." By the time he finished, the room was silent, and he could see people dabbing their eyes, touched by his words. Mr. Harrison led the applause, his face filled with pride and admiration. The ripple expands. After the speech, Caden received more than just applause. People came up to him, sharing their own stories of kindness, their voices full of emotion as they thanked him for reminding them of something they'd nearly forgotten. But the most unexpected surprise came later that evening. Mr. Harrison approached Caden and his father with a proposal. "Caden, your story has shown me how much we all need reminders of kindness in our lives," he said thoughtfully. "I'd like to start a charitable fund in your name, the Caden Jameson Kindness Initiative. It would be dedicated to helping people in need, providing them with winter clothing, food, and other essentials. And I'd like you to be part of it." Caden's eyes widened. "Me? But I'm just a kid." Mr. Harrison chuckled. "And that's exactly why I think you're perfect. You see things differently. You see kindness as it should be, simple, heartfelt, without any need for recognition. That's what we need more of in this world." Caden looked at his father, who nodded, his face full of pride. With a deep breath, Caden agreed. That night, as they rode home, Caden's mind was filled with plans and ideas. He imagined how the fund could help others, how the warmth that had started with a single coat could spread to even more people. And he thought about Eleanor and the quiet gratitude in her eyes. She had inspired him as much as he had helped her. By the time he fell asleep, he knew that this was just the beginning, that his journey of kindness had only just begun. The kindness legacy. Winter's grip began to soften as the weeks rolled on, but the warmth of Caden's story continued to spread. The Caden Jameson Kindness Initiative, or KG Kindness, as people affectionately called it, took off with surprising speed. Every day, more people volunteered, donating winter clothing, food, blankets, and basic supplies. Caden found himself at the center of something he never could have imagined, a movement inspired by one small, heartfelt act. Caden's days became a whirlwind of activity. Between school, homework, and helping out with KG Kindness events, he barely had a free moment. But he didn't mind. Each donation drive or community event filled him with purpose, and he cherished every second he could spend making a difference. His father was by his side every step of the way, offering support and encouragement, often staying up late to brainstorm with him or help organize volunteers. One cold Saturday morning, Caden and his father made their way to the city's biggest KG Kindness event yet, a winter coat giveaway at a local community center. As they arrived, they saw a long line of people waiting outside, huddling together for warmth. Caden's heart ached as he noticed how many of them were shivering, bundled in thin, worn-out jackets. He hurried inside, eager to start. Inside the center, volunteers were busy organizing tables filled with new and gently used winter coats, hats, gloves, and scarves. Hot cocoa and coffee were set up near the entrance, offering a bit of warmth to everyone who came in. Caden took a deep breath, feeling a rush of excitement and pride. This event was a tangible result of his journey, and he was ready to share it with the people who needed it most. As people entered, Caden greeted them with a smile, guiding them to the tables where they could find what they needed. He watched as kids his own age tried on warm coats, their faces lighting up with joy. He saw elderly folks gratefully wrapping scarves around their necks, a look of relief softening their weary faces. Caden felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was exactly what he had hoped for, a community united by compassion and kindness. An unexpected visitor. In the middle of the busy event, Caden's attention was drawn to a familiar figure near the entrance. He blinked in surprise. It was Eleanor, the woman to whom he had given his coat that cold winter night. She stood with her granddaughter, Sarah, both of them smiling warmly. "Caden," Sarah called, waving as she led her grandmother over. Eleanor's face was brighter, her eyes clear and lively, as if the weight of her hardship had finally lifted. Caden felt his heart swell with joy. He ran over to them, his face breaking into a wide smile. "Miss Thompson, you look great." Eleanor chuckled softly, holding his hands in her own. Her touch was warm, steady, a stark contrast to the frail, trembling woman he had met weeks before. "Oh, Caden, she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't begin to tell you how much your kindness meant to me. You saved my life in more ways than one." She paused, her eyes glistening with tears. "After that night, when you gave me your coat, something changed inside me. I realized that people still cared, that there was hope, and that maybe, just maybe, I could find my way back." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "She's been staying with me, and we've been getting her back on her feet. She's even thinking about volunteering with KJ Kindness to help others who are struggling." Caden's face lit up. "Really?" Eleanor nodded, squeezing his hands gently. "Yes, really. I want to give back, the way you gave to me. I want to help others feel the warmth you showed me that night." The three of them shared a quiet moment, the busy sounds of the event fading into the background. Caden felt a warmth in his chest that no amount of winter chill could touch. The ripple he had started was now coming full circle, returning to him in the form of the very person who had inspired his journey. Caden's growing impact. As the day went on, Caden continued to greet people, helping them find coats and gloves, handing out cups of hot cocoa, and sharing stories. Word had spread about KJ Kindness, and many people had come not just for the warmth of a coat, but for the warmth of connection and community. Caden met people who had heard his story and wanted to volunteer, neighbors who had never spoken to each other before, but now chatted and laughed as they worked together. At one point, Caden noticed a group of kids huddled near the back of the room, watching him shyly. He walked over, smiling, and introduced himself. "Hi, I'm Caden. What's your name?" One of the kids, a boy about his age, shuffled his feet, looking down. "I'm Jaden. We wanted to help out. I saw you on the news, and I guess I thought, maybe I could do something good too." Caden grinned, feeling a surge of pride. "Of course you can help. There's plenty to do. Let's get you guys some volunteer badges." He led the kids to the volunteer station, where they quickly got to work, sorting coats and helping people find the right sizes. Caden watched them with a sense of pride and hope. This was more than just an event. It was a legacy, a promise that kindness would continue to grow and flourish long after this day. As the event wound down, Caden's father pulled him aside, a proud smile on his face. "You've done something incredible here, son," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You've brought people together. You've given them a reason to believe in each other again." Caden smiled, feeling the weight of his father's words. He realized that KJ Kindness wasn't just about giving out coats or food. It was about building a community, about creating a place where people could come together and support each other. It was a movement, a way of life, and he was proud to be part of it. The legacy continues. The weeks turned into months, and winter finally gave way to the fresh blossoms of spring. The Caden Jameson Kindness Initiative continued to grow, expanding beyond their city to neighboring towns, inspiring people everywhere to come together in the spirit of compassion. Local businesses partnered with KJ Kindness, offering supplies and hosting events, and schools began organizing student-led kindness projects. Caden, now known throughout the community as a quiet leader with a heart full of compassion, continued to dedicate himself to the cause. His grades improved, his confidence grew, and he found a new sense of purpose that carried him through every day. One sunny spring afternoon, Caden and his father took a walk through the neighborhood. The streets were filled with people enjoying the warmth, kids playing, and families chatting on their porches. As they walked, Caden noticed a familiar red scarf fluttering in the breeze, tied to the handle of a door. It was the same scarf he had given Eleanor, a symbol of the journey they had both been on. "That's the scarf," he murmured, nodding toward it with a smile. His father looked at him, pride shining in his eyes. "That scarf started it all, didn't it?" Caden nodded, feeling a quiet sense of joy. "Yeah, I guess it did." They continued their walk, passing people who nodded and waved, recognizing Caden as the boy who had started a movement. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that his simple act of kindness had grown into something far beyond himself. Final reflections. As Caden lay in bed that night, he thought about everything that had happened. He thought about Eleanor, about Sarah, about the people who had come together through KG kindness. He thought about how one small gesture, a simple coat, had set off a chain of events that transformed lives. He realized that kindness was like planting seeds. Sometimes those seeds took root quickly, blossoming into something beautiful right away. Other times, they took longer to grow, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to sprout. But eventually, they would grow, spreading branches and leaves, reaching out and touching everyone around them. With a smile, Caden drifted off to sleep, feeling the warmth of 1,000 small kindnesses surrounding him like a blanket. He knew that his journey was just beginning, that there were countless more ways he could make a difference, countless more people he could reach. And he was ready. In the quiet darkness, Caden made a silent promise to himself to keep choosing kindness, no matter where life took him. And he knew that, as long as he kept that promise, the legacy of KG kindness would live on, spreading warmth and compassion to those who needed it most.